Another question that I've been asked is there a time when technology can be a problem for knowing God and making him known? If yes, when? If no, why? I want to answer this by putting our current 21st century communication in context. If you look at the history of the world, I would say that there are 4 communication eras. And those eras don't happen evenly in all places around the world at the same time. Some parts of the world are still in communication era 1. Some are in 2, some are in 3, and some are in 4, as you'll see in just a few moments. But increasingly, more and more are going rapidly towards this communication 4 era. Every people group, every ethno-linguistic group in history began as an oral people. The way they told their stories was around a campfire, face to face. They would gather in a circle. The young ones would be sitting on the laps of the parents. The older ones would tell the stories that the grandparents had passed on to them and the great-great-grandparents had passed on them in that way. And the stories were told and the immediacy of being gathered in a family setting, and you would have, at the same time in the same place, and you looked into each other's eyes, and the values, the memories, the traditions were passed on. At some point, most cultures, not all, some are still agraphos, that means are without a writing system, but most cultures develop some form of writing. And this is an amazing innovation. This would be your second stage of communication. And again, it didn't happen every place at the same time. It was not a one-size-fits-all. But when you learn to write and can read what has been written, something extraordinary happens. You can communicate across space and time. You can pass on the stories to those with whom you never are going to be at a fireplace with. You can pass on the stories to people who will be born after you die. And so this allows for a great expansion. And we have to realize that probably when Moses wrote down the books that we know as the Torah, there might have been some who wondered at the wisdom of what Moses was doing. He said, Moses, you're really messing with the way God has always spoken. We've told the stories around the campfires, and now you're writing it down on tablets, on papyri, and we're going to lose the relational aspect of the story if you do it this way. And so that sense probably was felt by some with Moses' innovation. But the thing that encouraged Moses is that God himself wrote on Sinai, the 10 Commandments. The scriptures make it very clear. Several times it says, with the finger of God, he himself wrote those. And he encouraged people to write. He ordered numerous times to write. So God innovated a technology revolution. He innovated new means of communication. And that, if God did it, certainly it wasn't to the detriment of relationship, but to the enhancement of relationship. And so there are obviously some things that aren't as intimate when you're reading as when you're looking straight into somebody's eyes. But if the option is, if you can't look in their eyes, having no communication at all, then the reading is the next best thing. And it allows the message to travel further and faster than it otherwise could have done. So cultures developed writing. And this was a laborious process. It took very few people gained the skill of writing. To copy a book by hand, scribal professions, it took a lot of time, therefore a lot of money, and it was a very elite class, and so very few people did this, very few people read, and then in 1452, Gutenberg invented the printing press. Now, Of course, there were printing presses earlier, both in China and Korea. So again, technology happens at different times in different places. But Gutenberg's press had an impact that others didn't have because he understood why we communicate. And the new technology he developed was to advance the Great Commission. So the very first thing he did was print the Bible in the local dialect, in German, not in Latin, not in the religious language, but in the language of people's hearts. That was revolutionary. The press was, but the fact that he chose the book in the vernacular language of the native peoples among which he lived, of which he was a part, was absolutely phenomenal. And that changed everything because this happened about 60 years before Luther nailed his thesis on the church doors, and the thing that we usually use as the beginning of the Reformation in Europe. And in those 60 years, over 1 million pieces of literature in German, biblical literature, Gospels, Bibles, Gospel portions, had been disseminated over that whole area. And because now instead of taking 3 years to write a Gospel, you could produce them by the scores in a week, the costs come down. It's no longer just for the elite, for the politically powerful, the financially wealthy, but it becomes into a middle class. Now, because it's affordable, it makes sense to learn to read. Why bother learning to read before if you can't ever hope to put your hands on a book? And so this brought a transformation, and because of that, it was a generation or two prior to Luther, this technology prepared the way for one of the greatest spiritual awakenings of all time. Without the printed press, there wouldn't have been the Reformation. And so, again, God, in his wisdom, released technology. So we read in Jeremiah that God is the one who gives power and might and wisdom. And this technology is a gift of God. It can be used for ungodly purposes, of course, but it was designed in order to advance Great Commission activities, and certainly was used marvelously for that. We come then now to the digital era, which is the fourth. So we've gone from oral to written to printed to digital. And what happens with the digital is the next level, because now communication is being democratized, being made available as never before. Because in a digital platform, you can communicate even if you never learned how to read. This is where text and audio and video all come together. All the prior forms of communication can be delivered in a device that, it's just this size and increasingly affordable and available to everyone. There's still a digital divide. There's still gaps, but the gaps are less now than in any of the other revolutions that occurred beforehand. And so the whole purpose is that with each stage, is thus potentially more inclusive and more accessible for the kingdom. And this is something that we really need to build on and see God use for his purposes. Many of us grew up at the end of the print era and the beginning of the digital. And for us, the Bible is this printed book. Well, that's only been true the last few hundred years that the Bible looked like that. But if we're going to touch the world in this next generation and beyond, it has to be on this platform. This is how God's word communicates. He comes always as a manual. He inhabits our world, not as it should be, but as it is. And this technology is as the world is. And God steps into it to make it become what he dreams it can become. So let's use these tools to the maximum for the glory of God.